Welcome all of you, and thank you for joining our Be Women weekly webinars to connect, to share, to learn what matters to us today, because it's in this very challenging time, it is important to really go inside, and especially with all this isolation, it's an amazing opportunity to reimagine ourselves and the future. And so these webinars of Be Women is all about that, going inside, learning about yourself, and also preparing yourself for the future. I'm Laura Giaduru-Koch, founder of Be Women, a lawyer in the state of New York and Argentina, and very passionate about the movement of using business as a force for good. Before we get started in this truly inspiring 50 minutes, we'll share a very brief introduction of what is Be Women. The topic today is climate impact measurements. What is real and what is hype? Our speakers and moderator both are over 20 years of specialized in impact investment and are Michele Demers, CEO of Boundless Impact Investment, and our moderator is Vivina Berla, CEO of Vimine Holdings. So what is Be Women? We are a global network of women entrepreneurs that seek to balance purpose and profits in the markets towards what we call a care economy, an economic system in which we genuinely care for people and nature as our top priority, where our values, respect, dignity, collaboration are our driving forces. And this webinar is exactly how do we measure impact in our companies? A few more seconds to start. Let me share the Be Women Empowering move that will inspire you to action throughout the whole webinar is to move your shoulders back, your chin up, your eyes that twinkle with joy and determination, and with a super wide smile. Vivina, the line is all yours.
Thank you, Laura. I always smile when you tell me to smile, so here I am. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Laura, for organizing it. Michele, thank you for your willingness to share your story, your journey, which is in a direction that has been keeping a lot of us in the impact investing world awake at night. And I certainly look forward to hearing from you what your solution has been. 2 seconds, maybe a little bit more, 2 minutes about me and my background. I spent 25 years in the institutional investment world, first with Merrill Lynch, then with Gartmore in London, across multiple asset classes and securities and geographies. For the last 8 years, I led the growth of a private equity impact investing firm focusing on mid-market growth stage companies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Member of the Investor Council of the GIN, I led the transformation of my company, my ex-company, through the process of becoming a B Corp, signatory of the PRI. So all the names that we love and treasure and cherish in our search of changing the way the capital is allocated by both small and large investors. More recently, I focused on the activities of Vimine Holding, which is my company, and everything we do is linked to bringing capital to finance companies that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. I took a broader approach than just impact investing, and the just is in inverted commas. One of the big challenges is measuring impact. And so I was very excited when Laura asked me if I wanted to moderate the conversation. And it's not really moderating, it's more sort of having a conversation with Michele, who is doing something really different and unique compared to the various systems and data bases and streams and quality and metrics that are available in the market today. Enough about me. I'm going to ask Michele to introduce herself and then maybe dive straight into the first question that I sort of prepared for all of us, which is asking Michele to tell us about what is Boundless Impact, at the same time as introducing herself and then diving into the follow-up questions.
Thank you, Vivina, and thank you, Lara. It's great to chat with everyone today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm Michele Demers, founder and CEO of Boundless Impact. We are an industry research and impact analytics firm that provides quantitative and evidence-based research and data for investors, companies, and funds. And I learned about impact investing when I was working for a Silicon Valley billionaire, helping set up a foundation for them, and had the experience of not only setting up a foundation to solve a certain social problem, but also putting private capital to work at solving that problem as well. And it was before the term impact investing was even a phrase. It was last decade. It was 2006 and 7 and 8, but it really inspired me. And so I turned my career in this direction.
Wonderful. And so the genesis of Boundless Impact, I mean, I love the word to start. It's you know, it's collaboration, it's having an effect, it's boundless, and it's creative, and it's innovative. But how did you come to it? What did you see in the market when you were working for this foundation that you thought was missing and that Boundless Impact, your company, could address?
Sure. So we've been around since 2014, and we started off just doing industry research. And we initially were founded to be a resource for private investors who are taking a lot of the risk and putting a lot of the capital to work, supporting social and environmental enterprises and emerging technologies, and who are making a tremendous difference with their capital, but who aren't always able to access independent, objective data that explains true and actual impact outcomes to inform their investment decisions. What I had found and observed was that too much of the research out there was superficial, looking more at only operational outputs of companies and not always measuring the product impact of companies in a way that was meaningful and really helpful in terms of informing their decisions. And then finally, there's a real just lack of data and transparency around privately held impact investments, and just providing insights and an information clearinghouse around that.
So just to make sure that we use the same words, intending them to have the same meaning. When you say private capital, you mean capital of private individuals, or capital that goes to companies that are held privately and therefore not listed on the stock exchange?
Yes, so it's trying to accelerate capital toward early stage and growth stage companies that are really transformative. But it also means in some cases alternative capital that is accelerating change in different verticals, whether it's our energy economy, our water economy, our education economy, our health economy.
Right. But the research that Boundless Impact does is on companies that are held privately or are listed companies, or both?
We do both. We just finished an assessment of a sustainable biomass company that's a public company. Mostly we've done private companies that are emerging technologies, but we are perfectly capable of assessing public companies.
Okay, thank you. That's much clearer than it was for me before I asked the question. And so as you have built your business, who are your clients I mean, you explain the services that you deliver: intelligence, research,
Yep.
more rigor, better data, better analysis. But after you have all that information and research, who are your clients?
So we have a subscriber base of approximately 70 family offices, representing about 200 or 20 billion in assets. And they're mostly private investors, but some funds and foundations. But we're now really expanding that considerably to include anyone who wants to subscribe to our research, because we don't want to limit it only to accredited investors. We don't think that's necessary anymore now that we're doing actual impact assessment and rating and scoring of companies, which I can tell you about. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we will touch on it. And so,
and just one other point. So we have about 600 experts. One of the ways that we work is we hire subject matter experts to do a lot of the research projects. And we have a network of about 600 experts from more than 40 different industries.
And so how do your clients or your subscribers use your services? What do they do with it? And I suppose linked to that question is, would companies be interested in using the results of your research and use it themselves?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're, it's probably going to be helpful for everyone on the call if I explain a little bit more about our climate impact assessment, but I can do that as we go on. But we have companies that absolutely use our climate impact assessment tool. Investors, for the most part, are subscribing to our industry research, but increasingly companies are as well. And what that industry research is it's just deep dives into different industries, emerging technologies in the environmental space and in the health space. Those are the two areas that we really focus on. And so when I say the environmental space, I'm talking about energy, transportation, materials, food and ag, waste, and water. And then in the health arena, there's a whole other set of industries and issue areas, whether it's diabetes or addiction or various health issues that are at the point of being either an epidemic or a public health crisis.
So it is so important, and I totally agree with you, to actually segment the market, because not all data is equally applicable to different companies in different sectors. And so you clearly have done a very sort of, again, rigorous granular segmentations of the activities of your companies and where they operate. Now, one thing when I learned about the existence of Boundless Impact is that I sort of immediately thought the terminology around sustainability, ESG, impact, can be very confusing to people. ESG has now become much more used than it was just even 2 or 3 years ago. How do you and Boundless Impact differentiate yourself from all the other frameworks, languages, measurement tools? Tell us, all of us. I'm really curious to learn. And
Sure.
Maybe specifically to the areas that you have been focusing on, which, as you said, to date are climate change and health.
Sure. So it might be helpful for me to share my screen and show a slide or two, just because I think it's going to be easier to understand how we define impact investing. So I actually had a slide that sort of explains what you just said, there's so many different terms used for values-based investing out there. It's quite complicated and confusing for people to understand. The way we look at it is impact investing is distinct from sustainable investing and socially responsible investing. And ESG is really sustainable investing, which is the next generation of SRI investing. So it's really looking at operational impact, and environmental, social, and governance practices are evaluated and looked at as a way of measuring and sort of trying to figure out if a company's being responsible. Impact investing is taking things to the next level because you're really talking about product impact. So you're talking about a solar company that is offsetting carbon through its product, or an EdTech app that is a math app, for example, helping children learn math better. So there's a clear product impact that you're actually able to measure. So it's just different between operational impact and product impact. And we consider impact investing to be really product impact. So that's kind of how we look at it. And the reason we focused in on environment and health was because these are two areas where there's very science-based traditions and methods for measuring impact that we could build on and use. So in the environmental space, we're using lifecycle assessment methods to measure impact. Our methods are very different than the methods being used in most financial ratings and many of the new impact ratings that are using financial ratings methods, which is more econometrics and inference and less actually measuring the material and energy inputs that a company has through its supply and production chain. And health is a whole other ball of wax. There are definitely traditions in terms of how academics and scientists agree upon in terms of measuring public health outcomes or even socioeconomic outcomes, and the kinds of metrics that we use to measure health impact.
That is fascinating. So if I understood you correctly, SRI ESG is actually how the product is produced and how to maybe measure the impact and minimize the negative effect of how a product is produced, and possibly maximizing the metrics, the good metrics of how a product is produced. Well, what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that impact investing, you're actually measuring using different tools the impact that the product itself has once it is produced and once it is out there.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, the governance factors that evolved out of socially responsible investing and corporate social responsibility are the most widely measured of the ESG factors, and the environmental are probably the second, because there are ways that companies are required to report on emissions. But as I'll explain to you, there's ways that we are looking at a company's impact that touch on not just the emissions of their central operation, but that the environmental impact of their entire supply chain and production chain. So it's looking at things like their transportation footprint, or their water footprint, or their waste footprint. There's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into consideration when understanding a company's environmental impact, and none of those are measured in traditional ESG metrics. It's called scope. I can show this to you. It's called scope 1 and 2 and 3 analysis. So let me just go down to it. So a lot of you on the call probably already know this, but the international community has put out 3 ways of greenhouse gas emissions measurement. There's scope 1, which is really the emissions from assets and operations that are owned and controlled by the company. Scope 2, which are emissions from consumption of electricity, heat, or steam. And it's only scope 3 that's looking at all emissions from the entire supply chain. So extraction and production of materials, the emissions of other companies in a company's supply chain, the transportation of materials and goods, etc. And so it's really the only analysis that provides investors with a really clear understanding of climate and business risks in a company's entire operation.
Which really leads me very neatly to the next question, which is, I think, and you know, you working for a foundation, you will know this and feel it very deeply. In the impact sector, I think one of the biggest challenges and dangers is that so many people are jumping on the bandwagon of, you know, green and low carbon and impact investing. And actually, there is very little available in the market to distinguish, and I go back to the title of this conversation, which is hype from reality. And so, you know, you and Boundless Impact is saying, okay, we are here to help investors make a difference between those that are really making an impact and those that are just pretending or saying that they are. Can you please, again, guide us, help us a little bit more about how you do it? Because it is so important. And measuring impact is a whole hornet's nest at the moment. So how are you helping?
There's a tremendous amount of noise.
Yeah,
because a lot of folks are using impact as a marketing term. You know, there's tremendously good intentions out there. The problem is we really need to measure it, because not all of the new companies and inventions and ways of doing things are going to be necessarily the best fit. And we really need to figure out which ones are the best market fit, so that those companies and those ways of doing things or ways of producing products or what have you are going to be established as the new normal. And it's just really tough to do that when there's so much noise in the space. And I would just say that I think there's a lot of investors that are, you know, invested in maintaining the status quo. And so they want to hold on to their assets and the worth of their assets. And we're moving into a really different world right now. It's going to be, we're moving into a carbon priced world. So imagine, you know, I haven't even shown you my methodology, which I will in a minute, but just a quick diversion. You know, when we move into a truly carbon priced world, and I have to say in Europe, you guys are already moving toward that in terms of creating carbon based or carbon value at risk products and ways of incorporating the value of carbon and emissions offsets into an actual value proposition of a company. So there's movement of that forward, and the state of California, I have to say, in the US is also making some great strides. They just came out with a low fuel standard, low carbon fuel standard regulation that is exciting and promising, that will hopefully drive this. But when we move to the day, which is not going to be so far away, it could be as little as 3 to 4 to 5 years away, when carbon is actually priced, a lot of the assets that are on a lot of our balance sheets of fossil fuel companies are counting all of their oil and their fossil fuels and petrochemicals as assets, are going to become liabilities. And the world is going to just change from and the global economy is going to get a real start from it. And I think the kinds of data and analysis that we're providing is preparing us for that, hopefully. So let me just tell you, if I could, about a bit about our methodology. So we use lifecycle analysis, and for everyone on the phone that is not familiar with lifecycle analysis, it is in engineering circles, it's very well known, and it's been practiced for several decades as a way of actually measuring the material and energy inputs and outputs along a company's sourcing, manufacturing, disposal, and consumer use operations. So it's really covering the whole product, like I was saying about the scope 3. And so what we did a couple years ago is after we basically did a study of a number of the different impact assessment frameworks out there, and we found that too few of them were using real data with integrity. There was too much self-reported data and unverified data. And that report is on our website. It's called Data-Driven Impact Measurement. We made a case for more quantitative ways of measuring data. And after we wrote that report, and I can talk a bit more about that later, that's what my earlier slides are about, if you want. But after we did that report and we saw that there's just it's really hard for investors to compare apples to apples when there's too little data that is correlating, basically. We decided to throw our own hat in the ring and hired some environmental engineers to help us develop this climate impact assessment tool. And what we're aiming to do is develop what we're calling the gold standard, which is using this life cycle analysis based approach. And we put together a report. We do a 6 to 8 week assessment of a company, and what my team of engineers who have deep experience in LCA are able to do is they look at an emerging technology and they figure out, let me just move to the next page to show you an actual example. So this is a battery company that we assessed for NYSERDA, is one of our customers. NYSERDA is the development arm of the New York State Department of Energy. And it was a feather in our cap that we got them on board as a client as early as we did, but they were impressed by our methodology. And what we do is we looked at this company, which is this is a zinc manganese dioxide battery. So it's an alternative battery. And we picked some other types of batteries to compare it against. And so in this case, we picked lithium ion, lead acid, and sodium sulfur batteries. And then we put together a list of metrics, and the metrics we came up with are on each point of this spider chart here. You've got carbon return on investment, product GHG, energy footprint, water footprint, carbon payback. VOC footprint is looking at the hazardous materials that are necessary to handle the chemicals. And we always look at a product cost. So we look at mostly environmental metrics, but we do include some financial metrics that we think are essential and that are really key to demonstrating that correlation between environmental impact and commercial viability. And so this was a company that we assessed last summer, and this is a sample of one of our reports. So we put these 7-page reports together, and we actually score the company. And I'm not sure I have a score here to show you guys, but please reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about our methodology. But we do provide information on a company. This is a biomass electricity company that we analyzed as well. And actually, I can show you the score here. So we score the company on per unit impact. And that is looking at how does that company's impact for each of those metrics that we looked at compare to its competitors. We also look at alignment with SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And what we're doing essentially is we're quantitatively measuring the impact of that company. And we're also establishing benchmarks for that industry. So the next time we go to do an assessment of a battery company, we would then have the benchmarks already to be doing that assessment.
That is so interesting. So you create, in this case, a benchmark for the battery industry. If an investor wanted to compare the impact of a battery company with the impact of a different type of companies, would they be able to do that using your methodology?
Some of the metrics are going to go across. So they could compare the carbon return on investment across industries. But there are other metrics that it's going to be harder. You know, it's easier for us to do it within an industry, but we certainly can, with certain metrics, do it across industries. And that's what we're planning on doing. We're planning on building this out, automating and streamlining this tool so that we can assess a lot more technologies across a lot more industries.
Very interesting, because that is something that I know as an impact myself, an impact investor myself. It's very difficult when you have so many choices and so many opportunities. How do you actually wrap your mind around, you know, which one and why, and what are the metrics that you need to choose and compare, and
Right.
the question of materiality, all of that, I'm sure you've given it a lot of thought. And you know, you were saying earlier how we're all trying to measure impact. It's not easy. and then it's true that not only the frameworks are difficult to put together, but then the quality of the data is, as you were saying earlier, not necessarily credible always. And so you have really been very brave in addressing such a thorny issue. And what we have seen today during the call is very encouraging. I suppose the other thing that you mentioned earlier in terms of you know, sunk assets and oil companies. There is Carbon Tracker in Europe. I'm sure you know Mark Campanale and their work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're quantifying the commercial issues of their, you know, carbon pricing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much you use their data in your evaluation work.
I mean, we'd love to, where it's relevant. Once we start to build out our industry data and analytics tool, I'd love to talk with them about integrating our resources. Absolutely.
Right.
Right now, we've been mostly asked to develop these because they don't exist for a lot of these industries in a way. So that's why NYSERDA asked us to put this together. And we did it for a composite materials company as well. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to standardize the way that things are measured using these very agreed upon science-based methods, because we think it's actually going to lead to a clear correlation between impact performance and actual financial performance. And that's what I think investors are looking for. You know, there's definitely issues around correlation between some of the existing, let me just find my notes here because this is worth mentioning. I think CSR Hub found that MSCI and Sustainalytics rating companies in the S&P Global 1200 Index had a really weak correlation. And that's because the methods being used are not the same. And that's why there's so much confusion. Just by way of example, credit ratings between Moody's and S&P's have a correlation of 0.9 because they're only focusing on those financial factors. So until the financial community can really agree upon how they're measuring things, and quite frankly, we would advocate that they use these more science-based methods because they're actually more reliable than just taking self-reported data from companies and taking it for granted that their companies are telling the whole picture themselves without the data being verified. So I believe we need entities like Boundless is trying to build and others have already built that are truly verifying data.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you mentioned earlier your data-based investing report, which I read, and I think Laura will circulate to all participants after this call. And it is a really good report, really well worth reading. And there were a couple of things in there that sort of struck me, including sort of, and you may want to refer to now your earlier slides, but the importance of quality data, the importance of verifiable and verified data before the analysis.
Right.
There was a chart of a pyramid that depicts the activation of impact as you go from sort of less data to more data and better use data.
Yep.
Can you please maybe tell us a little bit about your findings and what people can actually read about in that report?
Absolutely. Let me just go back to earlier. So, so obviously we were trying to understand by doing this report, this investigation, we were trying to understand how measurement was being standardized and was just how it was happening, who was doing more measurement. And we felt that there was, in our gut, we felt that there was a need for more rigorous analysis. If you look at a lot, as I was mentioning, if you look at the ways that data vendors are collecting data, they're leading investors to different conclusions. And it's not always material information, to use the word material like you did earlier. And so you get things like this index, which shows, which I think is not accurate, which is MSCI listing a company like ExxonMobil on its low carbon leaders index. And so we don't think that, and we looked behind the scenes there, and we felt that there was just too much. The reason why you've got these, if you look at all these companies, look, they're all giant companies. So the problem is these, most of these mainstream indices are putting so much emphasis on financial factors that the impact factors are being diluted and basically washed away. That's what I would argue is the problem, that they're not being weighted adequately. And part of it is that there's just so many different weighted factors. So in terms of impact measurement, when we did this study, we found that far too many of the existing methods for measuring impact were relying on self-reported data, surveys, which creates subjective data, site visits, things that don't create scalable, repeatable, and comparable data. And it's qualitative data, and it's often incomplete. And you can see here that it's what investors have cited. This is a Paribas, Bank of Paribas, BNP Paribas study that cited that investors cite the lack of robust data as a significant barrier to actually putting their capital. And so this is the report that we put together that basically makes the case for more quantitative ways of measuring data. And we believe that what we need are a more comprehensive analysis, better methodologies, incorporating experts, and establishing best practices, and really looking at impact according to sector or industry. So there are different ways of measuring impact and different metrics that you're going to use for alternative proteins versus water purification. You're not going to use the same metrics all the time. There will be crossover metrics. Like I said, carbon return on investment is pretty across the board, but there's just different metrics. So, you know, when it comes to water purification, you're not using transportation metrics necessarily for the most part. With sustainable packaging, you often are. And so that kind of led us to building this. So that's a little bit of the highlight on that report.
Wonderful. Just before we started the call, Michele and I were sort of having a conversation about why MSCI might have built an index as they did. But maybe we can leave that conversation for later. I think we are about 15 minutes away from the end of the call. I can speak about this for the next 2 hours, but how about we see, Laura, if there has been any questions or if there will be any questions from other participants who might want to write them in the chat, and then we can address those, and otherwise I have plenty to follow.
This is Laura. basically there's a few questions. Actually, there's many questions, and I would focus on the questions of maybe Armando Luis that says he's one of the directors of Portugal of B Lab, and would like to know how does your methodology compare to the B impact assessment, given that we are B women and many of the people here have used them. That's one of the questions. So please let us know, and we'll continue with a few other questions.
So, you know, I never like to compare and contrast myself to other impact firms, because I think everyone in the impact space is making a heroic effort to try and wrestle this monster to the ground. So I think they do incredibly important work. I would say they're relying a lot more on traditional survey methods, number one. Number two, their method also is, from what I've seen, it's looking at more traditional ESG factors around social impact, things like things that are hard to collect data around and compare, such as governance issues. And sometimes you can actually say, do you have women? Do you have a majority of women in your, do you have a certain percentage of women in your company? Do you have, different gender factors? So they're often looking at a lot of these ESG factors, which are more qualitative and less quantitatively, you can't really put a unit of measure around them, I guess, is what I would say.
Maybe also to complement that, you may want to speak about efforts by groups like GRI, the Global Reporting Initiatives, just to try and see where does Boundless impact fit in this ecosystem of well-intentioned people, as you say, who's trying to wrestle this beast to the ground.
I mean, I don't mean to be difficult, but I think we're more disruptive than a lot of the existing methods that are using kind of the same financial ratings methods or the same, we're using lifecycle analysis. It's much more different. It's very different. And so we're expecting our methodology to be adopted in the venture and the private equity community and the hedge fund community and the kind of emerging technology world prior to it moving into influencing public markets, because we just need to establish it and collect a lot more data before we can really establish it. And I think we're a lot more bottom up because we're starting with these different industries. They're a lot more top down, which is looking across portfolios, quantitatively assessing just a few questions for each category. It's so different. It's really hard to compare. A lot of those methods are looking at public companies. They're not as much looking at private companies.
And Michele, thank you very much. Here, there's another question by Ximena Martinez. She says, in startups, based on your experience, what should be the first things to navigate, to do based on what you've learned and what you see in the future coming for metrics in environmental and climate sustainability?
Well, what I've found is that companies that take the time to get assessed by us, they raise money faster because they're actually showing how they're more competitive against their industry peers, if you will. So I think it's looking at impact measurement not as an afterthought, but looking at it as integral. A lot of companies are taking a lot of the data and analytics. They're making product design changes or operational decisions differently because they're realizing their environmental impact and is going to affect their commercialization path.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point. Basically, start measuring before everything as soon as you start, or putting it into into place so that you don't have to recreate it afterwards.
Right.
And here there's a question about tokenized learning. That's something that I am not familiar with. And they say, so then it's just to see whether this can be, if this will be a platform that can be used more broadly or open source.
Okay, so what we're going to do, rather than make it open source, is we're going to make it reasonable, priced reasonably. But we are a for-profit company, and I really believe we should be a company and not a nonprofit. And so that we can, you know, actually operate by making money rather than depend on grants and others driving our agenda. But I do believe that we've basically put together, you know, sort of price comparisons of what our subscription rate would be compared to subscription rates of other either industry research or data and analytics vendors, and we will be far cheaper. Yeah. I mean, compared to MSCI, which is like, you know, extremely expensive, we would be far more reasonable. So we're going to be mission driven in that way.
Yeah, and also, Michele, you organize every year like a mini conference on all the new learnings on climate change and sustainability. Will you do this again this year? Will it be online, or so that we can also invite everybody who's this fall?
Yeah, definitely. We're going to do it in the fall, probably in November again. And then we have monthly webinars. You can find those on our website on different topics. So you could learn about our framework there. So yeah, and yes, we're definitely going to do that climate summit workshop, we called it. It's not quite a summit because it's not that big, but we'd love to have as many folks as want to attend.
Excellent, thank you. Any other more questions, Vivina, you want to address?
I suppose what I would love, and maybe that is at the base of some of my confusion, is a lack of proper understanding of what is data-driven investing. Mm-hmm. And so I understand from our call and our conversation that it is sort of a combination of the quality of the data that is used to making the decisions, but also the way it is collected and the way it's looked at, and then how it links to the decision-making process and the life cycle assessment. So it's a combination, and again, please correct me, it's a combination of the type of data, the quality of the data, the way it's harvested, when it is harvested, the framework of life cycle assessment as opposed to just one moment in time. And then all of that makes you different.
Right. I mean,
did I get it all wrong?
When we get a snapshot of a company's impact, we're getting it in that moment. That's their actual impact in that moment. So we're going to have to update our data over time. So if we have created a score for that battery company, that's the score we gave it the date we delivered that report. That data is going to need to, it's a living thing. It's going to need to be updated regularly in terms of that battery technology's carbon return on investment or energy intensity as it compares to its the lithium ion and the lead acid and the other batteries. That's going to be an evolving and changing. So that's the thing about the data. It's just evolving over time based on different circumstances. With climate, you're looking at geographic, regional scenarios. We assessed a waste to energy company, and we looked at one of their operations in Thailand, and we looked at one of their operations in Massachusetts, and the waste feedstock was very different in both places, and the fuel profile of the power grid was different. So in Massachusetts, they were relying a lot more on natural gas. So it was we came up with different scores for the same technology in 2 different locations. So it's just, and so what we need to be able to do is create ways with our, hopefully with this data and analytics tool that we're going to build out, different ways that you can slice and dice the data based on use case of the technology, geographic case, and things like that.
So if I subscribe to your database, I'm going to be able to see for whichever companies you have already looked at and analyzed, the research piece that tells me, we looked at this company, these are the metrics that we feel are important for the activities of this company. This is how we have collected the data throughout the life cycle assessment. And this is what we think this company is sort of delivering in terms of impact on the climate or environmental impact.
I mean, we're hoping it's going to be simpler than that. We're going to have a score, and the company's going to have a score, and then they're going to be ranked against their competitors. We're hoping to simplify it a little bit more. Not hoping, okay. We are going to simplify it. So it's like you'll first look at the score, then you can read the report. Hopefully, eventually, we're going to have 10 battery companies or 20, and you're going to be able to see how that technology ranks against the other technologies. Okay. So the idea is that we're trying to quantify things as much as possible.
Okay.
So the score will be public, or will it be just companies that are part of your network?
It's, if you subscribe, you can get our scores.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So any other questions? I think that there's a lot of comments in the chat, and I will be sharing the chat with the people here. And here they say, one of the things that I would ask everybody on the line, given that we have a few minutes left for this call, is what is the one thing you have learned on this webinar, and how would you apply it today? Because what is Be Women is all about is about creating action after you hear a webinar. And so while we are wrapping up this webinar, I would like you to suggest it on your website, on the chat. What would you change? What would you do different today after what you heard from the inspiring words of Michele? And on this note, I think that Michele, you're reading some of the questions.
Yeah, I am. I'm just trying to see. Someone asked about scope 3 analysis and the boundaries, and that's a good question. How do you determine the boundaries for scope 3? You know, there are system boundaries when you do a life cycle analysis, and you have to determine what they are. And so sometimes there's going to be multiple, depending how complex a product or industry is, or technology, we're gonna sometimes have different boundaries for different types of analysis. So it's a really good question. It's a really long answer for me to answer it, but understanding life cycle analysis and the fact that you have to have actual system boundaries in order to statistically measure. I mean, we could do broader system boundaries, but it would take us a lot longer. We're doing these assessments in 6 to 8 weeks. So the boundaries, I would say, for scope 3 is the company's supply chain. So it's looking at their transportation. It's looking at every aspect they touch on with the environment. But you're not actually maybe, in some cases, you're maybe not going to the point where you're looking at waste disposal or customer use, because it's too broad in order for you to actually measure it in a way that's going to be really quantifiable and comparable. So this is a wormhole that I better not go down because it's going to be too complicated for everyone. But there are ways that we have to basically put boundaries around the ways that we're measuring and comparing technologies. And that's a really important thing. So there's a scientific validity to it and you're truly measuring apples to apples. But maybe I can follow up with that person another time.
Excellent. That would be great. I will let you know who they are, and I will make sure. So on this note, maybe we should wrap up. And if you would like to do some closing remarks, Michele and Vivina.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I would just encourage everybody to read our report on data-driven impact, and we have a report coming out in May on climate impact measurement that is going to be explaining a lot of this even further, and that one's going to be available on our website. And our website's boundlessimpact.net. And I would just say, keep an open mind about how this is all evolving, because we are moving to a carbon price world. And I think that it's going to by necessity need to happen sooner than later, that the global financial system catches up with that.
Excellent. Thank you. And Vivina, do you want to say some closing words? I think Vivina, you're muted. So
sorry about that. Thank you to Michele for adding a very interesting and different element to the conversation. It is a difficult one. I echo Laura's words. We need to act. So we are never going to find, well, sorry, never. It's very difficult to find the silver bullet the first time around. So we should do, experiment, learn, and refine, and do again. And I find these conversations very helpful to, allow me to try, do, and repeat.
excellent. Well, thank you. On that note, I would like to close this amazing and very interesting and thought-provoking webinar. Because what Be Women is about, we are about action, about issues on gender and climate change. And this one is exactly what matters. We need to measure how we deal with climate, because whatever gets measured gets done. And so, Michele, thank you very much for this call. Vivina, thank you for the moderation and the dialogue. And what I want to mention to you is, now that you have a few minutes left before we close, is I would like you to get a pen and a piece of paper and write down exactly what are you going to change? What are you going to modify in your life based on what you heard? What were the thoughts and ideas that were provoked from this webinar? Because only when we act right away, when we hear it and we decide, okay, I'm going to send this SMS, I'm going to talk to this other person. When you write it down, you get it done. So, and we need to get action done in the next few months, because we are about to finish our quarantine, maybe in a few weeks, hopefully. And so then we're going to have to act. Yes. And so on this note, we have a lot of webinars coming up. Mostly are about self-introspection and understanding. The next one in English, because we have them in Spanish, in English and Portuguese. The next one in English is For Family Forum, a must skill to stay connected in the family, by Amir Fir. And this is a very important exercise, because imagine if you can create forums. That it was a YPO creation over 50 years ago for business leaders, actually to put all those principles of forum in your family. So once a week, you meet with all your family, even with your grandparents and parents, because now we can be all connected, and a dialogue about things that matter. What are the issues? What are the conflicts that you've had for many, many years under the Aragon? You've never reported them. And then on that, we also have on the 30th of April, Nonflict, the art of everyday peacemaking, that is part of also the forum methodology. As well, we have another webinar on brain management during uncertain times. What do you do with yourself, and to become more, to create habits that really help you, so that when you think of this period, 10, 15 years ago, you say, during coronavirus, I learned so much. I acted so much. I exercised every day. I meditated every day. I'm kidding. But, we created habits that really are life changing because, we need to do the best out of this challenging times. And also one of our webinars coming up is unpaid and underpaid care work, the global inequality crisis by Jan Borstad. And basically, Be Women is all about moving forward towards the care economy, where we really value what is the environment, what Michele has taught us today, and care for people. And on that, I would like to close and thank you all for this amazing time we've had together.